December 16th, 1944. Northern Ardennes. The fog lay thick over the ridgelines like a wet woolen blanket, muffling sound, swallowing silhouettes, turning every tree into a grey specter. At dawn, the German artillery had opened up, thousands of guns roaring in the dark, and now, as the light crept reluctantly into the forest, the American forward positions along the Elsenborn Ridge were trembling under the weight of the heaviest barrage those men had ever faced. Captain Walter Huxley of the 2nd Battalion, 395th Infantry Regiment, huddled behind a shattered tree trunk, listening to the crack and thunder of 105s overhead. The earth shook, branches snapped like bones, snow fell in sheets, shaken loose by the concussions. His men, Kentuckians, New Yorkers, farm boys from Kansas, machinists from Pennsylvania, pressed themselves deeper into their foxholes, clutching rifles that suddenly felt very small in the face of the storm. No one spoke. No one dared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Ardennes offensive had begun, the surprise attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. But Huxley and his battalion did not yet know the scale of what was coming. They knew only the simple, savage truth. The Germans were attacking, the shells were falling, and the forest was coming alive with the sound of boots and shouted orders in harsh, guttural German. To the east, down the slope, massing in the pines, were the men of the German 277th Volksgrenadier Division, hundreds of infantry preparing to surge forward as soon as their artillery lifted. Their mission was brutally simple: break the American line, take the ridge, and open the road to Liège. And they were confident. They had numbers, they had momentum, they had surprise. What they didn't know, what would kill them in minutes, was that the Americans atop that ridge carried something the Germans had no answer for, something new, something the Germans didn't even know existed, something called the VT fuse. Half a mile behind the infantry line, hidden under camouflage nets stretched across a clearing, the gun crews of the 18th Field Artillery Battalion worked with mechanical precision. 12 M2 105mm howitzers sat lined in the snow, their barrels black with oil, their trails dug into the frozen ground. Each crew had been awake all night. Their faces were smudged with grease, eyes red from exhaustion, breath steaming in the frigid air. They checked elevation, adjusted fuses, slid shells into breaches, listened for orders. Lieutenant Charles Charlie Ridgway stood beside Did Gun 4, collar turned up against the wind, binoculars pressed to his eyes as he peered over the ridge into the fog. He couldn't see the German infantry massing below, but he could feel them. The ground had a certain tremor, a certain tone, a subtle vibration that told him large bodies of men were moving in unison. Ridgway knew what that meant. They were coming, and they were coming in force. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Sergeant Joseph Mazzarelli, the best gunner in the battery. Mazzarelli was a wiry man from New Jersey, quick with his hands and quicker with his curses, who could dial in a target with uncanny instinct. He was grinning now, a thin, dangerous grin. "Sir," Mazzarelli said, "you want us to use the new toys?" Ridgway nodded. "Yes. Set for VT." The gun crew went silent. Even the wind seemed to still. The VT fuse. Most of them had heard rumors, the stories whispered through the artillery branch like campfire myth. A radio-controlled fuse, a proximity fuse, a device smart enough to know when it was near a target, a shell that would detonate in the air above an enemy, showering him in lethal fragments like an invisible scythe, a shell that turned the very sky into a weapon. The Germans had no idea it existed, and in 40 minutes, 600 of them would be dead because of it. At 0930 hours, the fog thinned just enough for Captain Huxley to see movement. Dark figures emerging through the trees, spread in long lines, rifles slung. Machine guns carried on shoulders, officers gesturing with urgency, Volksgrenadiers, hundreds of them. And still more shadows behind. His heart tightened. "So that's it," he murmured. "The whole damn division is coming." Private Lennox, crouched beside him, swallowed hard. "Sir, we gonna hold?" Huxley didn't answer. Not out of fear, but because he didn't want to lie. He lifted his field phone. The line hissed with static. Somewhere in the wire network connecting the ridge to the batteries, a branch or shell fragment had pierced insulation. He tapped the handset, adjusted pressure, and shouted into the line. "Fire mission!" Down at the artillery position, Ridgway heard the shout through the phone line before the operator relayed the message. "Germans are advancing in battalion strength. Danger close. Use VT. Repeat, VT." Ridgway didn't hesitate. "Mazzarelli, you heard the man. VT fuses. Rapid fire." Mazzarelli spat into the snow and barked orders. The gun crew moved like an engine. Shells were lifted from crates, smooth, heavy, green-painted 105mm HE rounds. The nose cones were opened, the old point detonating fuses removed, and then new silver cylinders were screwed in. These were not mechanical fuses, not impact fuses. These were miniature radar sets. Small, compact, miraculous. Each one was a technological leap so great that the men were forbidden to talk about them, forbidden to let them fall into enemy hands, forbidden even to approach unexploded shells lest the fuse be captured intact. But today, the first day of the Battle of the Bulge, they were going to unleash them. Mazzarelli looked at Ridgway. "Elevation?" Ridgway glanced at the map, at the slope, at the estimated distance of the advancing Germans. 600 yards, airburst height 15 to 20 feet. Mazzarelli nodded, serious now. "All right, boys," he shouted. "Let's show Jerry what American science looks like." Grenadier Wilhelm Frank of the 277th Volksgrenadiers trudged through the snow, rifle at his shoulder, heart pounding, but hopeful. The American line ahead was thin. The ridge looked weak. Their officers said the breakthrough would be easy. They were told the Americans didn't even know the attack was coming. They were wrong. As his platoon reached a clearing at the edge of the woods, Frank lifted his head at a strange sound. Overhead, not the usual artillery whistle. This was deeper, rounder, almost like air being ripped apart. "Artillery," a soldier behind him said uncertainly. "Maybe behind us." But before Frank could reply, the sky above him burst open. The shell detonated 20 feet above the German column. The explosion wasn't a normal blast. It was sharper, flatter, an airburst optimized to fling hundreds of white-hot steel fragments outward in a perfect sphere. It tore through men like invisible razors. Frank heard the sound before he registered the pain. Like hailstones striking a frozen pond, then screaming, dozens of screams, men collapsing around him, clutching shredded limbs, faces ripped open, blood spraying across the snow. Another shell burst overhead, then another, then another. On Elsenborn Ridge, the gun crews had gone into full rapid fire, the howitzers recoiling violently with each shot. Boom, boom, boom. Shells arced through the sky, their fuses alive, listening, sensing, searching for the reflective echo of bodies beneath them. When they detected the Germans, they exploded, never in the ground, always above it, where the killing radius was largest. To the Germans, it seemed as if the Americans had planted invisible mines in the air. Whole platoons fell within seconds. Machine gun teams were wiped out before they could set up. Officers were shredded mid-command. The snow turned red so quickly that steam rose from it. Captain Huxley watched the destruction unfold and felt something cold in his chest, a mix of relief and horror. "Jesus," Lennox whispered beside him. "They're being cut down like wheat." They were. 600 Germans would die in the next 2 minutes, not because of overwhelming numbers, not because of tanks, but because the sky above the tree line had become the deadliest killing zone of the entire Ardennes front. Within the doomed German battalion, chaos erupted. "Scatter! Find cover! Get to the trees! Medic! Medic!" Men dove into the snow, only to be caught by another airburst, detonating directly overhead. Others ran for the woods, limbs pumping, minds blank with terror, only to be torn apart before they reached the first line of trunks. Wilhelm Frank crawled, shaking, ears ringing, vision blurred by blood dripping into his eyes. He could hear his sergeant shouting, But the sergeant's voice cut off in a wet final sound. The fragments had no mercy, no direction, no limit. It felt like God himself had turned against them. At the gun line, Ridgway moved from crew to crew, shouting corrections through the thunder of the guns. "Shift 50 left. Raise elevation 3 mils. Keep firing, keep firing." Mazzarelli's gun was firing 8 rounds a minute, an unbelievable rate. The brass shells stacking like golden towers beside the breach. The ground trembled continuously. Smoke drifted through the clearing. Crewmen's faces were coated in soot, their gloves burned, their muscles screaming from exertion. But they didn't stop. They knew the Germans were breaking. They knew the VT fuse was doing exactly what it was created to do. They knew this moment would be remembered. And, above all, they knew that if the ridge fell today, the road to Liège would fall with it. So they fired until their shoulders ached, until their hands blistered, until their ears bled from the constant recoil. On the forward slope, Captain Huxley watched the last organized German groups disintegrate. There was no charge now, no rifle fire, no cohesive line, just shattered survivors stumbling backward, dragging wounded comrades, slipping in the blood-slick snow. Artillery had done what infantry alone could not. It had stopped the massed attack cold. 600 men gone, an entire battalion erased, all in under 3 minutes. At 09:36, the firing stopped. The gun crews stepped back from their howitzers, chests heaving, sweat freezing on their foreheads despite the cold. Mazzarelli sat on an ammunition crate, breathing hard. "Sir," he muttered, "that was something. I've never seen artillery do that." Ridgway didn't answer at first. He just stared at the smoke drifting upward from the forest. He knew what they had just done. He knew this weapon, this fuse, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Finally, he said quietly, "It's going to change war. Forever." Behind them, distant screams drifted through the trees, German wounded lost in the snow, crying for medics who would never arrive. The VT fuse barrage had done its work. But the day was far from over. Because, deep in the Ardennes, Hitler's offensive was still unfolding. More divisions were coming. More attacks, more waves, more danger. The ridge would hold today, but the battle had only just begun. The January rain came in sideways sheets, carried by a wind cold enough to cut through wool and discipline alike. Plymouth Harbor bobbed with hundreds of vessels, liberty ships, transports, tank landing ships, and hulking cargo craft that looked, to Admiral Sir Charles Little, like floating warehouses with their sides chopped off. They crowded every berth, every slip, and every stretch of seawater deep enough to float steel. Somewhere behind all that steel and smoke lay the greatest gamble in British military history. And it would be carried on American decks. Little stood on the elevated catwalk of the Harbor Operations Tower, one gloved hand clutching the railing. Spray hit his face as another tug pushed an LST toward its assigned mooring. One of 22 scheduled to arrive before dusk. The Admiral exhaled. This wasn't a build-up anymore. It was a takeover. He heard boots behind him. The clattering gate could only belong to Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, the British planner whose job had become, through a curious twist of fate and politics, directing an invasion that he no longer fully controlled. Morgan shook rain off his cap. "You're looking at it again, Charlie." "Hard not to," Little said. "Every hour, a new convoy arrives. At this point, I am convinced Washington is emptying the entire eastern seaboard into Plymouth." Morgan leaned beside him on the railing, following his gaze. Out on the water, a column of American LCIs, landing craft infantry, entered the harbor in parade fashion. Their bows were pointed like spearheads, their hulls battered from training accidents off the Carolina coast. Diesel fumes drifted toward the tower as the convoy throttled down. "They warned us the build-up would be unprecedented," Morgan said. "Unprecedented," Little muttered, "is not the same as impossible to organize." Morgan laughed shortly. "And yet, we're organizing it." A crane hoisted crates from a Liberty ship's deck below. Stenciled on the nearest one were the words U.S. Army Ordnance and High Explosive, handle carefully. 2 American dock workers guided the crate with practiced ease, shouting instructions in accents from Brooklyn and Kansas alike. Little's jaw tightened. The Americans arrive with everything, he said. Cranes, forklifts, berthing crews. And confidence, Morgan finished. Little grunted. Some might call it arrogance. Some might, Morgan admitted. But without their arrogant factories, we'd still be patching together converted ferries for landing craft. The Admiral didn't reply. He didn't need to. Both men knew the truth. Britain, exhausted by 4.5 years of war, simply could not match the American avalanche of steel. The invasion, their invasion, would live or die by American production lines. They retreated inside as the wind intensified. The operations tower was a cramped affair, half of it filled with signal equipment and telephones that never stopped ringing. Maps were pinned to every surface. A chalkboard by the door listed expected arrivals. Convoy UGS 13, 38 Liberty ships. Convoy UGF 4, 12 LSTs, 6 LCIs. Convoy X-88, 9 transports, 4 vehicle carriers. At the bottom, someone had scribbled in chalk, tonnage, 184,000. Morgan whistled low when he saw the number. 2 years ago, we couldn't dream of these figures. And today, Little said, we're drowning in them. The two officers made their way to the central planning table. A handful of British naval officers were discussing berth shortages. 2 Americans in olive drab stood opposite them, pointing to the map with impatient energy. We have to unload by the 18th, the taller American was saying. Our schedule isn't flexible, Captain. The British officer, Captain Ramsey, looked ready to explode. I don't know how to make this clearer. We haven't room for 60 more craft. We're turning ships away as it is. We can't turn them around, the American insisted. The convoys are still coming. Washington expects full offload capacity. Morgan stepped forward. Gentlemen. The arguing ceased. Captain Ramsey looked relieved. The Americans straightened to attention. Morgan rubbed a hand over his face. Captain, we will find the berthing. Commander Phillips is clearing the North Key this morning. Use it once those coasters depart. Yes, sir. And you two. Your schedules are duly noted. But Britain isn't the Chesapeake Bay. Space is limited, and the wind doesn't take orders from Washington. The Americans exchanged looks, slightly chastened. Morgan nodded once, dismissing them. When they walked away, he leaned toward Little. I fear we're not just managing an invasion force, we're managing 2 competing empires. Little gave a dry smile. One empire is nearly bankrupt. The other is printing money faster than they can spend it. I wonder which one believes it should be in charge. They moved to a window overlooking the loading docks, where columns of vehicles rolled down ramps from a cargo ship. Half-tracks, ambulances, jeeps stacked in triplets, an assembly line flow of American war machines, painted fresh olive green and smelling of diesel and cosmoline. Morgan watched in silence. Then softly, Do you know what General Paget said to me last week? Little raised an eyebrow. Which one is Paget again? C Home Forces. Loves his horses more than his staff. Morgan clasped his hands behind his back. He said if the Americans keep arriving at this rate, the invasion fleet won't look British at all. The Admiral scowled. There it is. National pride? National identity? Little said. We began this war alone. The Americans intend to finish it on their terms. Morgan didn't disagree. But perhaps that is the price of victory. Little shook his head. Victory should not require humiliation. Thunder rolled overhead, or so it seemed, until Morgan realized it wasn't thunder at all. The floor vibrated. Engines, dozens of them. They rushed back onto the catwalk. A formation of American B-26 Marauders swept low over the harbor, their twin-engine roar drowning out the wind. The bombers flew in perfect diamond formation, as if choreographed for an air show rather than another miserable January workday in Devon. And trailing behind them, another formation. And another. Little's mouth fell open. Good God. Morgan's voice was a whisper. How many aircraft do the Americans have? Enough, Little said hoarsely. Enough to lose 1,000 and not blink. The bombers banked eastward, headed for training fields across the channel. Their presence wasn't necessary. The British RAF could handle all local patrols, but American commanders insisted on constant readiness drills, arguing that any gap in preparation could cost lives on D-Day. Morgan watched the formations vanish into the murk. This isn't just an invasion fleet. It's an industrial onslaught. Little nodded once. We asked for help. They answered. He took a slow breath. Perhaps too well. Later that afternoon, Morgan crossed the muddy road toward the American headquarters, located in a requisitioned hotel overlooking the quay. The building still retained its old sign, the Cornwall Arms, but its interior had been transformed. Military maps hung from the walls. Typewriters clacked non-stop. American MPs checked passes at every stairwell. The U.S. presence was overwhelming, even here. He pushed open a door, marked Operations. Combined. Inside, officers from both nations huddled over a massive map of the French coastline. Dozens of small flags marked potential landing beaches. Some zones were circled. Others had been crossed out completely. Brigadier Lee Mallory, air commander and one of Churchill's favored officers, stood near the map, arguing with an American colonel whose red face and clenched jaw revealed rising frustration. "I'm not authorizing more airborne divisions," Lee Mallory snapped. "Dropping paratroopers behind German lines is suicide. We risk losing 10,000 men before the first landing craft touches the beach." The American colonel slammed his fist onto the table. "We risk losing everything if we don't secure those exits. You can't bottle up an army on the beaches." Morgan stepped forward. "Gentlemen, please." Lee Mallory straightened. "Morgan, perhaps you can talk sense into our colleagues." The American bristled. "Sense is what I'm trying to talk into you." Morgan raised both hands. "Stop. Both of you." He took a breath. "Every operation comes with risk. We can debate the airborne portion later, but right now we must finalize the inbound logistics. Our supply projections are lagging 7% behind scheduled American tonnage. What happened to the last convoy?" A captain replied, 4 ships were delayed by U-boat shadowing near the Azores. They diverted north and will arrive in 3 days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Morgan nodded grimly. "Then we must dock more efficiently. If necessary, we will clear civilian vessels by force. Britain's fishing fleet can be temporarily relocated." One of the American planners said, "We appreciate that, General." Morgan met his eyes. "We don't do it for appreciation. We do it because this invasion must work." The American nodded. And with that, the room relaxed, just slightly, enough for officers to return to the map, the schedules, the tonnage lists, the staggering web of detail that would determine the fate of the assault that history would call Operation Overlord. When Morgan left the headquarters, dusk had already settled. The harbor glowed with the lights of a city made of steel, ship after ship, crane after crane, vehicle after vehicle filling every space like pieces of a puzzle too large to comprehend. He lit a cigarette against the wind. The match sputtered twice before catching. Down the hill, he saw a group of American infantry marching in double time. Their boots splashed water. Their cadence chants echoed through the evening air. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to fight this goddamn war. It sounded nothing like British drill. Too loud, too brash, too confident. When they passed, one of the GIs waved at him as if greeting a neighbor. Even in general, hell of a night. Morgan nodded back, amused despite himself. A British soldier wouldn't dare speak to a general like that. Not even in jest. He resumed, walking toward the harbor. Rain tapped steadily against metal and water. The cranes continued unloading as if powered by the rhythm of industry itself. American MPs directed operations with crisp, efficient gestures. Standing amid the whirlwind, Morgan finally understood what Admiral Little had meant. This was no longer Britain's war, not by scale, not by logistics, not by momentum, but perhaps that was its salvation. Near the water's edge, he found Little again, alone, coat-drenched, staring across the harbour as though trying to read the future written in the silhouettes of ships. Morgan approached quietly. "Charles, it's late." Little didn't turn. "Do you know the tonnage of Churchill's entire navy in 1914? Morgan blinked at the sudden question. "Roughly 2 million tons, Little said. "The pride of the Empire." He pointed toward the anchored convoys. "The Americans have landed nearly that much just for the invasion staging areas. And it's February. Not even the final build-up." Morgan stood beside him, side by side, in the rain. The Admiral finally turned. His expression was not fear, but something deeper. The realization of a world shifting beneath their feet. "They will overshadow her," he said quietly. "After the war, in every way." Morgan considered this. Then gently, "Maybe. But if they help us win, what does it matter whose shadow we stand in?" Little stared at him for a long time, then gave a small, exhausted smile. "You always were the optimist." Morgan smirked faintly. "Only on Wednesdays." Silence settled between them. Finally, the Admiral exhaled. "Very well, Fred. Let the Americans bring their convoys, their planes, their tanks, their confidence." His eyes hardened. "But the plan, our plan, must hold. We are not handing over the invasion entirely." Morgan nodded. "Agreed." And in that moment, 2 British officers, soaked through, standing amid the greatest harbour build-up Europe had ever seen. Something shifted, not in strategy, not in politics, but in resolve, because the truth was undeniable. To defeat Germany, Britain needed America, but to guide America, America needed Britain. Only together could they pull off the impossible. A giant foghorn bellowed across the harbour. Lights rippled along the superstructure of a newly arrived Liberty ship. The name on its bow, barely visible in the mist, read SS Richard H. Lee. Morgan watched it maneuver into position. Little spoke softly. "There, another one." Morgan nodded. "Another piece of the greatest fleet ever assembled." "And soon," Little added, "another reason for the Germans to tremble." Morgan smiled thinly. "Let's hope they do." They turned away as rain intensified, heading back toward headquarters, where more arguments, more planning, and more impossible decisions awaited them. Behind them, the harbour pulsed with life. An industrial heartbeat echoing across the Channel, across Europe, across the world. A fleet was being born. A nation was rising. And history was gathering momentum. February in southern England was a grey blur of cold drizzle and frost that clung stubbornly to the waking earth. The fields around Portsmouth and Southampton had long been churned into mud by the endless movement of troops and equipment. Every road had become a corridor of trucks, jeeps, and heavy artillery rolling toward the coast. Inside the cramped war rooms and headquarters, the pace had reached a fever pitch. Telephones rang in endless loops, typewriters clicked like machine guns, and the low murmur of urgent conversation filled every corner. The invasion was no longer just a plan. It was a war within a war, one waged on maps and schedules, on radio frequencies and supply manifests. And in the midst of it all, the men charged with executing Operation Overlord grappled with problems no general had ever faced. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan sat at a battered oak table littered with maps, telegrams, and weather reports. His brow was furrowed. Outside the window, the steady drip of rain traced rivulets down the glass. Across the room, a young Royal Air Force meteorologist stood nervously, clutching a folder of charts and satellite photos. "General," the man began, "the weather pattern over the English Channel is expected to deteriorate over the next 72 hours. Low cloud cover, heavy winds from the southwest, and a rising tide." Morgan nodded grimly. "We can't launch under those conditions," he said. "The landing craft need calmer seas, the bombers need clear skies, and the paratroopers need visibility to avoid chaos." The meteorologist swallowed. There might be a brief window in 3 days, sir, but it's tight and uncertain. Morgan leaned back. Uncertainty is the enemy of every invasion. But we don't have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions. He tapped the map with a pencil, tracing the jagged coastline of Normandy. We must prepare for every eventuality. If the weather denies us the beachhead, we have to be ready for delay. Or worse. Elsewhere in the war room, Brigadier General James Gavin, commander of the American 82nd Airborne Division, tensed with restless energy. The airborne operation was his obsession, dropping thousands of troops behind enemy lines, in darkness, sowing confusion and seizing vital bridges and crossroads. We have the element of surprise, Gavin told a group of officers. The Germans don't expect an attack here. If we move fast and strike hard, we can cripple their defences before the main force hits the beaches. Captain Robert Miller, a liaison officer from the British 6th Airborne, frowned. The risk is enormous, Miller said. You're asking men to parachute into hostile territory at night with limited support. The margin for error is razor-thin. Gavin's blue eyes sparkled. War is risk, Captain. If you want safety, stay behind the lines. He paused, scanning the faces around him. But I agree, this operation will test us. The weather, the terrain, the enemy. It will not be easy. Captain Miller nodded reluctantly. We'll prepare as best we can. Gavin smiled. Good, because this is how we win. In the docks at Southampton, dock workers laboured around the clock, unloading crates stampeded with the seal of the United States Army Quartermaster Corps. The air smelled of salt, grease, and diesel. Pallets of ammunition, medical supplies, fuel drums, and rations piled high. Colonel Thomas Richardson, in charge of logistics for the American forces, inspected the operations. His sharp eyes missed nothing. Keep this pace, he barked at a foreman. The men on the front line need every round, every bandage, every meal. Without supplies, the invasion fails before it begins. Nearby, an RAF sergeant approached with a clipboard. Colonel, we have a problem with truck allocations. The British transport units are stretched thin. Richardson cursed under his breath. We're dependent on their trucks and drivers. If they're overloaded, we lose precious hours. The sergeant nodded. We're working on it, sir. Richardson rubbed his temples. We'll need more vehicles and fuel if this is going to work. He looked out over the docks. No shortage of men or equipment, he muttered, but moving it all. That's the real war. At an unassuming cottage near Portsmouth, a group of intelligence officers gathered in whispered discussion. Their job, to crack the German defences, decode enemy communications, and feed vital information to the invasion planners. Captain Eleanor White, one of Britain's top cryptanalysts, studied a decoded message fresh from Bletchley Park. The Germans are reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, she said quietly. Additional artillery batteries at Omaha and Gold Beaches, more troops in Caen, and a significant increase in coastal patrols. Major Charles Foster frowned. We expected this, he said, but it means our window is shrinking. We must strike before their defences become impregnable. Captain White nodded. Agreed. But there's something else. She passed the message around, the officer's red eyes widening. A unit called Panzer Lehr is being deployed nearby, White said. Elite armoured division. If they engage in force, the beaches become a bloodbath. Foster shook his head. That changes everything. We must alert the commanders, White said, and prepare for heavier resistance. In the bustling American headquarters at Portsmouth, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat alone in his office, the weight of command pressing down on him. His desk was covered with maps, notes, and letters from soldiers and civilians alike. He rubbed his tired eyes. The invasion was imminent. But doubts gnawed at him. Could they really pull it off? Could this enormous, complex machine of men, machines, and plans move flawlessly in the chaos of war? His aide knocked softly and entered. General, the latest weather reports are coming in. Eisenhower nodded. Brief me. The aide laid out the charts. Conditions remain poor. A slight break on the morning of the 5th. Eisenhower stared at the map. He picked up his pen and wrote a note. If the weather does not improve, delay the invasion by 24 hours. He exhaled. The fate of millions rested on the weather and on decisions he could only hope would be wise. Back at Plymouth, Admiral Sir Charles Little oversaw the final assembly of landing craft. The harbour was a chaotic ballet of ships and men. His radio crackled. "Admiral, the minesweepers report heavy activity off the Normandy coast. Enemy minefields." "Yes, sir. We're increasing patrols and clearing routes, but progress is slow." Little frowned. "We can't afford delays," he muttered. "The entire fleet depends on safe passage." His thoughts turned to the men who would sail those landing craft, crossing the channel into the jaws of death. He thought of the engineers, the riflemen, the medics, all depending on a safe crossing. He thought of the thousands waiting on the beaches for supplies and reinforcements, and he thought of the enemy, watching, waiting. The weight of command pressed down like the cold rain. As night fell, the coastal towns bristled with tension. Soldiers huddled in muddy fields, their faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. Some wrote letters home. Some stared silently at the stars, knowing they might not see them again. In one tent, near Portsmouth, Private James Cooper of the 1st Infantry Division wrote in his journal, "Tomorrow might be the day. I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if anyone is, but I do know that if we fail, the whole world will pay the price." Nearby, Sergeant William Harris checked his rifle, then looked at the sky. The clouds hid the moon. No stars. The darkness felt complete. He whispered a prayer and settled in. In London, Winston Churchill stood before a map in the cabinet war rooms. Surrounded by his generals and ministers, he spoke with the authority that had carried Britain through darkest days. "The success of this invasion will decide the fate of Europe," he said. "Failure is not an option." He paused. "But victory will require sacrifice, courage, resolve." General Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, nodded. "We are ready, Prime Minister." Churchill looked out the window toward the Thames, the lights of a city holding its breath. "We pray the storm passes," he said quietly, "and that history remembers those who gave everything for freedom." The dawn of February 5th broke cold and grey. Morgan awoke early, checking his telegrams and messages. The weather had shifted. The window predicted was opening. He moved quickly. By mid-morning, orders flew across command centers. The invasion fleet would sail. The airborne troops would drop. The gamble would be taken. As the armada prepared to leave port, soldiers lined the quays, faces pale with anticipation and fear. Morgan stood among them briefly, offering words of encouragement. "This is the moment we've trained for," he said. "Stay strong, stay united. And remember, we fight for our homes, for freedom, and for those who cannot fight." A hush fell over the crowd. Then a chorus of voices rose. "For king and country." Morgan smiled thinly. It was time. The ships began moving, a slow procession threading through the narrow harbour exits. The engines roared, the sailors and soldiers steadied themselves. Morgan watched the last transport slip beneath the grey sky. The invasion had begun. The weight of nations was now at sea, and beneath the waves, German U-boats waited. In shadowed patrol lines, their periscopes slicing the ocean, they readied to strike. The coming days would be measured in hours, in lives, in the fury of men determined to decide history. As the fleet crept forward through the ice, sea, and cold spray, tension gripped every man aboard. The vast armada stretched as far as the eye could see, hundreds of ships bristling with troops, tanks, artillery, and supplies, all bound for the jagged coast of Normandy. On board HMS Valiant, Captain James Harwood stood on the bridge, peering through the mist. The sea was deceptively calm, but he knew better than to trust appearances. The English Channel was a graveyard, littered with ships sunk by mines, U-boats, and fierce storms. "Steady as she goes," he murmured to his officers. "We're almost there." Below deck, Private Samuel Wilkes clutched his rifle tightly, his knuckles white. He was 19, fresh from training, and caught somewhere between adrenaline and terror. This was what he had prepared for, what every nightmarish drill had promised, but nothing could prepare him for the reality waiting beyond the horizon. The murmurs spread among the men. Some whispered prayers, others told jokes, hoping to stave off fear, but all shared one certainty. This voyage was a one-way ticket into history. Far to the east, the German coastal defenses were waking. Lookouts scanned the grey waters, their binoculars cutting through the mist for signs of the invasion fleet. Soldiers in bunkers checked their weapons, the heavy rumble of distant artillery like thunder in their chests. General Erich Hoffmann, commander of a coastal artillery battery near Omaha Beach, stood by a heavy gun turret, his face grim. "We have orders to hold at all costs," he told his men. "But the radio silence from headquarters is worrying," one lieutenant muttered. Hoffmann nodded. "The Führer demands no retreat. This coast will be defended with every last man." Yet, even as they prepared, Hoffmann sensed the weight of inevitability pressing down. The Soviet advances on the Eastern Front, the faltering Italian campaign, the war was turning against them. Still, here, on this stretch of sand and cliffs, they would fight. They would make the Allies pay dearly. In the skies above, the first squadrons of Allied bombers roared toward their targets, piercing the low clouds. Pilot Lieutenant Elizabeth Grant gripped her controls as her B-17 shook violently under anti-aircraft fire. "Keep steady," she urged her crew. "We have a mission to finish." Below, the beaches began to burn. Craters blossoming from the pounding bombs, defensive positions shattered. The air smelled of smoke and burning fuel. Despite the chaos, the invasion planners watched anxiously through binoculars and radar screens, waiting to see if the airborne troops would land where they were meant to. Paratroopers, dropped behind enemy lines in the deep darkness, scattered into the fields and forests, grappling with broken equipment, enemy patrols, and the overwhelming silence of occupied land. Major James O'Connor, leading a company of the 101st Airborne, cursed the wind that carried some of his men far off course. "We must regroup quickly," he barked into his radio. "If we don't secure the bridges, the beach landings will be slaughter." Every minute lost increased the danger. Every lost man was a knife twisting in their collective effort. Back on the beaches, the first waves of infantry disembarked under a hail of machine gun fire. Corporal Henry Dawson hit the sand, his heart pounding. The roar of bullets was deafening. Men fell around him, screaming, bleeding, dying. But Dawson moved forward, shouting to rally his squad. "We take that bunker," he yelled. With grit and desperation, the soldiers fought inch by bloody inch. The beaches became a hellscape of mud, blood, and shattered dreams. Amid the carnage, the VT fuse, a silent, deadly revolution, proved its worth. Artillery shells with this new proximity fuse detonated above the ground, unleashing lethal sprays of shrapnel that shredded enemy soldiers entrenched in foxholes and bunkers. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hawkins had overseen the distribution of VT-fused shells to field artillery units. Men reported that entire enemy positions were wiped out before they could even raise their heads, Hawkins explained later. The fuse had transformed indirect artillery from a blunt instrument into a surgical weapon. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.